people are in the marketplace singing like, Saul has killed his thousands, but David's killed his tens of thousands, right? Like David's going up against these Philistines and God's just giving him victory left and right. And Saul's getting jealous. Not to mention he had some spiritual stuff going on that was not good, right? But Jonathan remained loyal to David, even when his father was going up against him. And even knowing that God had told David that he was going to become the king instead of Jonathan once Saul died. So what happened is King Saul and Jonathan were both killed. And David's love and covenant to Jonathan remained even after Jonathan died. Because Jonathan had a son and his name was Mephibosheth. That's a hard one to say, Mephibosheth. And when they were killed, Mephibosheth's nurse was afraid that the Philistines were going to come and kill him too, right? Because he's like another son of the king. And so as she was running, she apparently dropped him and broke, or somehow he became lame. Both of his legs were injured in the process. And now Shannon and I had a discussion this week about her mom said that she dropped both of her sisters. And no, that's...
Well, that's what happened.
So yeah, that explains a lot, but forget it. I don't know why I even went there. It's not in my notes. I just need to stick with my notes. But it is true. It did happen. They're fine. I guess that could be questioned. No. So King David, now king, wants to honor Saul and especially Jonathan's family. And he asks if there's anyone remaining in their family. And of course, Mephibosheth was probably hidden away.
Right.
Still out of fear. Not only of the Philistines, but also of King David. I imagine that he was probably told lies his whole life about what would happen if King David ever found out that he was alive. But David's like, is there anybody? And he calls somebody in because somebody knows, somebody's heard something, and they find out about him. And David calls him to the palace. Now I'd be like, whoa, but what do you do? The king has called you to the palace. And he comes, and he's afraid, apparently. Because David has to tell him, listen, don't be afraid. You have nothing to fear. And David, because of his covenant love for Jonathan, he restores all of the land that belonged to King Saul. That had to have been a lot of land. He restores all of it back to Saul's family, to Mephibosheth, and gives it to him.
Wow.
That's a big commitment. David could have taken that land for himself. It was his. And not only that, but he let Mephibosheth eat from his table the rest of his life. Eating at the king's table. When he first encountered him, he said, he was like, I am your servant, David. I am your servant. Like, I just imagine him just almost begging and pleading for his life. Like, I'm not going to come against you. But David's love for Jonathan was expressed, that covenant love, to this next generation, to his son. The covenant, commitment, and love continued after Jonathan's death. And this is the first characteristic of covenant love. That covenant love is loyal. It does not give up. The amazing thing is that God himself made a covenant of loyalty with Abram. And we see a picture of God himself cutting covenant. Maybe you've read this before and totally missed it when you read it. But let me read this to you. This is in Genesis 15:9. So the Lord said to him, to Abram, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. Now you get that picture, right? However, he didn't cut the birds for whatever reason. Okay, verse 13. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain, so this is the promise, okay? Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated here. Okay, I guess that wasn't the promise, but it was true. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. Okay, skip to verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen. Okay, and actually, Abraham had to be put out. Okay, he was like, I forget what it says, but like either enshrouded in a cloud or like almost put to sleep. Now, why would God do this? Because when God shows up in the Old Testament, you cannot look at him, right? You cannot see God. Like, it's too much for you. And so he had to put Abram out, because look what God is getting ready to do. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared. And what did it do? It passed between the pieces. Do you see what's happening here? God himself, because he often comes as fire, right? God himself is showing up in the presence of Abram and walking between those two pieces. He is making the covenant commitment himself to Abram, that I will do this for you. Okay? And then this is the promise. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. And then he lists all these lands, all these places that he's promising to Abram to give him. That's our God, that he will make that commitment for us. Abram didn't even have to pass through himself. God did it. He said, I am making this commitment. Of course, God's word to the Hebrew people, of the Hebrew people being strangers in a strange land for 400 years came true, right? In Egypt. We've read about the slavery there. Now, I wish I had time to outline that story, but I don't. So let's just we're going to fast forward. So there's the 10 plagues. There's Pharaoh. But the last one is the greatest plague. And what happened is the greatest miracle. To me, it's the second greatest miracle ever in history outside of the cross. And that is when God delivered his people that by now had grown to who knows how many in number. They're still enslaved in Egypt, making bricks of straw and hay, and demanded to do all these different things, building projects. And the final plague is what? He says, I'm going to pass through Egypt, and I'm going to kill all of the firstborn males throughout Egypt, and all of the firstborn animals. He says, but Israel, I want you to do this. I want you to sacrifice a lamb. You're going to keep it in your house for 4 days. Then you're going to sacrifice it. And you're going to take the blood of the lamb and you're going to paint it on your doorpost, on the door jamb around there. And when I see that, I will pass over that house where I see that. I will pass by it and I will not kill the firstborn that are in that place. Okay? So they had to smear the blood of the lamb on the doorframe. It was their way. That there was nothing else they could do, right? To avoid this, except for just obey. That was their way of appropriating their faith and their trust that God was going to do what he said he was going to do. He said, just do it. And then he said, be ready to go. Don't worry about packing stuff up. Don't bake any bread with yeast in it to let it rise. You're not going to have time. Just bake your bread flat without yeast and be ready to move. And so what happened is Moses led his people out of Egypt in the great escape, saved by the blood of the lambs. You guys hear where we're going. God again made a covenant with Moses and his people after they came out of there, after they passed through. This was a conditional covenant. And this was the covenant that included the 10 commandments that we know so well as over 600 commands. And the promise was, the conditions were blessing for their obedience, but there would be curses that would come against them for disobedience. And this may not sound like what love looks like to us. Okay? I don't go, wow, so if I disobey, you're going to do this to me. Okay? But keep this in mind, that God was making a relational commitment to them. He was making a relational commitment to his people. And a commitment to bless those that were his own. And the stipulations of the covenant, the things that he asked them to do and to not do, stood in very stark contrast to the other nations around them. Because what happened is, if they didn't obey, they were easily pulled into the things around them. They were sucked into the culture around them. I think there's something to be said for us too. You know what I mean? How easily, when we're not following the Lord's plan, that we can be sucked in and enticed to go the way of our culture around us. That's why he had stipulations on them. And we don't understand some of them because it's like, well, that's the ancient Near East. They had very different culture than we have today in our land. So the things that they believed stood in stark contrast to the one true God. And of course, we know that Israel over time became unfaithful to God. They had their moments, but in the end, they did not uphold their end of the covenant. And here's the clincher. That God remained true to them even when they were not faithful to him. Yeah, he kept his covenant. Over and over and over again, he could have just dropped them because they had broken their side of the covenant. But any time that they came back, he said, I'm not done with you yet. And he welcomed them back. You know, well, check out these words of Nehemiah as he prays. And Nehemiah lived in a time where his people had been taken captive again because they were so disobedient to God that God just left them to their own devices and they were taken into captivity. Nehemiah says this, but they, our fathers, acted ignorantly. They became stubborn and would not listen to your commandments. They refused to listen and did not remember your wondrous deeds which you had performed among them, like freeing them from slavery to Egypt. What a miracle. So they became stubborn and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God of forgiveness, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness, and you did not forsake them. And check out this, Nehemiah 9:30 and 31. However, you bore with them for many years. Forbearance. That means like sticking with someone even when they don't deserve it anymore. Has anybody had to forbear with someone in your life? Yeah. And admonished them by your spirit through your prophets. So you encouraged them. You tried to tell them this is the way to go, right? Yet they would not give ear. Therefore you gave them into the hand of the people of the lands. Nevertheless, in your great compassion, you did not make an end of them or forsake them, for you are a gracious and compassionate God. That's your God. Slow to anger, gracious and compassionate. That's one of my favorite passages, that the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love and mercy. And I noticed that passage shows up several times throughout the Old Testament. In the Psalms and in different places. God's love is steadfast. It's unfailing. Even when his people were unfaithful, he did not give up on them. But at some point, his people had broken their side of the covenant. So many times, they were like yo-yos coming close to God. We see the kings. This king kind of led people closer to God. This king pulled them away. This king kind of did okay. This king, they're like yo-yos, up and down in their relationship with God. Then they'd forget the Lord altogether. Then they'd find the scriptures and they'd be like, wow, look at what the promises that God made to us.